There we go. All right, so we are live, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms and families and homes around the world. We're so excited you guys could join us, not just in general, but especially during the summer. We know that school's out, and a lot of you could be doing all sorts of other fun stuff, even if you're sort of stuck at home. So we really appreciate you being here live and on YouTube to hear from a really fantastic scientist on a really cool topic, and one that's close to my heart as well. So over the last few weeks, we have been doing a feature of a four-part series with Dr. Lydia Greene of the Duke Lemur Center. So the Duke Lemur Center is one of our biggest partners. We've done, I don't know, 30-something broadcasts with them. People love lemurs. But we wanted to do something a little more special and sort of follow a train of thought, a topic over the course of a couple of weeks, and really blow your mind with some really in-depth, fantastic lemur stuff. So we've already covered Lemur Science 101. So if you're coming to lemurs for the first time, we've done those two broadcasts, the why and the how, why people study lemurs and how they go about it in one of the most amazing places in the world, in Madagascar. So both those broadcasts on our YouTube channel, check them out when you're done. They're really cool. But today we have graduated. We've gotten our gold star, we've gotten our sticker, and we are going on to Lemur Science 201 to learn a little bit more in depth about how lemurs survive on leaves. Now, I don't survive on leaves because I would rather not. I like going to the grocery store, getting a whole variety of nice things, but some lemur species live solely on leaves. And we're going to learn a little bit of how they do that, why they do that, and a little bit more, again, from a person that couldn't be more equipped to tell you about it in the most enthusiastic way possible. So welcoming Dr. Lydia Greene joining us, and she's going to blow our minds. Thank you so much for coming in today, and take us away.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining and thanks for returning. And I'm going to take a second and just go ahead and pop on my screen share so we can dive into slides rather than looking at my face. Jesse, does that look good to you?
Looks beautiful. Let's do it.
All right, so let's get going. Thanks for the introduction, and what you said is exactly right. We're now graduated to Lemur Science 201, and we're going to talk about how lemurs survive on leaves. So in Lemur Science 101, we got a bit into the background of lemurs, why they're so special, why scientists are fascinated by them, why there's so many species on one island, Madagascar, and how it is that we as scientists go about using the scientific method to study lemurs, to generate new information and new knowledge about them. And so equipped with those toolkits, we're now going to progress to Lemur Science 201 and apply what we know to some topics that are near and dear to the hearts of myself and Marina Blanco and other research scientists at the Lemur Center. So I've spent the better part of my career studying how lemurs survive on leaves, specifically how they use gut microbes to survive on leaves. So we'll talk a lot about that today. And then next week, Marina is going to talk about the topic that's near and dear to her heart, which is hibernation in dwarf lemurs. So just make sure you come back for that as well if you think it's interesting. But so let's get into leaves. Oh, wait. There we go. All right, so I am personally fascinated by this idea of leaf eating in lemurs. We see lemurs eating leaves in nature all the time. We see it in YouTube videos. We see it when we come to the Lemur Center for a tour. We see it when we visit Madagascar. Lemurs are constantly stuffing leaves in their face. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever stopped to think about why, it might seem kind of weird. Leaves are not that nice to eat. Just as Jesse was saying, that's not what we're excited to eat when we go to the grocery store. Nobody's like, I can't wait to get that spinach. We're like, I want like fruit snacks and granola bars and pancakes. We want things that taste a lot better than leaves. So why are lemurs eating leaves all the time? And this is something that has fascinated me for a long time, this idea of how lemurs get enough nutrition, enough energy out of these sort of like nasty resources that are out in the environment, and why they're choosing to do this. And so really what we want to ask is, what's the deal with leaf eaters? What is the deal with leaf eating? Why? Just what's going on with this? So getting back into the why again, and then we'll get into the how. And so first I need to introduce a little bit of technical jargon, some terms, and the big one being the word folivory. So folivory is a feeding strategy in which an organism, an animal, known as a folivore, primarily eats leaves. So I'm going to sometimes use leaf eating, and sometimes I'll use folivory instead, and I might use leaf eater or folivore. And so folivory and folivore are the scientific terms for what a leaf eater does. It eats leaves, practices folivory. And I've got the word primarily here in italics because that's going to become important, because when we think of folivores, we think of animals that only eat leaves, but it's going to turn out that a lot of these folivores can eat a lot of different food items, but they spend a lot of their time eating leaves, but that's not the only thing that they can or will eat. So that's going to become important. So stay tuned for that. And it turns out that part of the deal with leaf eaters in Madagascar is that Madagascar has a shockingly large number of folivores. Madagascar is covered in folivorous species in a way that we don't see in other groups of primates or other groups of animals more broadly. So we're all familiar, I hope, with the cockerel sifak. This guy here, this is Elliot. He lives at the Duke Lemur Center. He loves his sumac. That's what he's eating right here out in the forest. But Elliot is only one of 9 different sifak species that live all over the island of Madagascar. And they all vary in color, they vary a little bit in size, and they vary primarily in where they live. But there are these 9 different species within this group of lemurs. There's also the charismatic indri. There's only 1 species of indri, but many of us are familiar with indri as well because they're so spectacular looking, the largest of the living lemurs. And then there's also a group of lemurs called the woolly lemurs that might be less familiar to many of us because they're nocturnal and they also don't survive under human care. So there's none in captivity anywhere that I'm aware of. But there's 9 species of woolly lemur that also live all over different parts of Madagascar. And together, these 3 groups, the sifak, the indri, and the woolly lemur, form one family of lemurs that are called the Indriidae. And this is where terminology gets really confusing because the family name for this group of lemurs are called Indriidae. You can also call them the Indrids, but one member of the Indrid group is the Indri, whose scientific name happens to be indri. So things get really, really confusing, and I'm going to try to be really clear as to when I'm talking about all of these species or when I'm only talking about the indri. So I'll try to keep that clear, but it gets really confusing even for us scientists as well. Now, on another different branch of the lemur family are these guys, the sportive lemurs. They're on a completely different part of the family tree. They're not really that related to the indrids at all. And they're called the sportive lemurs. And probably these are pretty unfamiliar to a lot of us as well, because they're also nocturnal and they also don't survive under human care. So you won't get to see one at your local zoo. But there's 26 species of sportive lemur that live all over the island of Madagascar. And these guys belong to their own lemur family that's called Lepidlemuridae, which is a really big and complicated word to say. But these are the lepidlemurs. And so lepidlemurs decided to become folivores, just like the indrids did. But those 2 occurrences of folivory are independent. So these lemur groups decided to become folivores independent from each other. So this didn't come from a common ancestor. They just independently were like, I shall eat leaves and that shall be my decision in life. Okay, cool. There is a 3rd group of folivorous lemurs in Madagascar that should be more familiar to many of us, and these are the bamboo lemurs. So there's the greater bamboo lemur, that's Lemur Science, and there's only 1 species of that guy. And then there's also the lesser bamboo lemurs in the genus Hapalemur that might be more familiar to us. And there's 5 known species, at least the last time I counted, of these lesser bamboo lemurs. And these guys also belong to their own family that's independent of these other guys. That's the Lemuridae family. And this family contains many of the lemurs that are near and dear to our hearts. It contains the ring-tailed lemur, the rough lemurs, the brown lemurs, and these bamboo lemurs. And so again, this acquisition of folivory, the bamboo lemurs deciding to become leaf eaters, happened independently of these other lemur lineages. And so we see this strategy of leaf eating popping up all over the lemur family tree in different places and at different times. So there's a lot of leaf eating in Madagascar, and this is unusual to have this proliferation of folivorous species. And like I was mentioning, these lemurs live all over the island of Madagascar. I should say these maps are a little bit outdated. The new IUCN assessments just produced new maps. If you're interested in looking up the new red listing assessment for the lemur species, I would encourage that. But what you can see is that these lemurs really live all over the place. Some species like the indri and the greater bamboo lemur are restricted to those eastern rainforests. And some of these other lineages live in every forest that's left in Madagascar, including in some of these dry areas. And generally what you see is within any of these groups, say within the sifaks, those different pockets of red are going to be different species. So you won't find the same species in the rainforest as the dry forest, but pretty much any forest you go to is going to have a sifak in it if it's a good quality forest. And what I hope you can also see is that there are many places where a lot of these species live in the same place at the same time. So in many forests in Madagascar, you're going to have sifak, indri, a woolly lemur, a sportive lemur, and a bamboo lemur. So 5 folivores living in the same forest and possibly fighting over food, right? Because they're all eating leaves. Which brings us to the question of how do these lemurs all survive in the same place at the same time? And if we go back to the whole story of episode 1, where we're talking about adaptive radiation and niche differentiation, it turns out that even though these guys are all leaf eaters, they all eat different types of leaves, or they all eat different sort of food resources. And so if we look first at the indrids, so this whole first family, the sifakas, the indri, and the woolly lemurs, what you really see is a change in how much they're prioritizing eating fruit to actually just eating young leaves. And so as we go from the sifak from left to right, we can see the sifak actually eats a lot of fruit and quite a lot of flowers. And a huge chunk of its diet is not based in leaves. And so we actually consider sifaks to be frugofolivores because they're fruit and leaf eaters. So even though they can eat a lot of leaves, when there's a lot of fruit around, they're going to go for that. They'd much rather have a peach than a piece of lettuce at the grocery store. As we move from left to right, we move into the indri, who's really a young leaf specialist. Anywhere from 50 to 90% of his diet is going to be based in young, tender leaves. But the indri will eat fruits and flowers when they're around, especially in the rainy seasons and the seasons of plenty. And as we get into the woolly lemurs, we've lost now that fruit in the diet, and we really eat young leaves. About 98% of this lemur's diet is rooted in young leaves. And so we can see this change in what the lemurs are eating, even though we classify them all as folivores. Now, sportive lemurs have gone down a completely different route, and pretty much everything about the sportive lemur is bizarre in Madagascar. So sportive lemurs, because they're in their own evolutionary family, they've gone off and done their own thing that's independent from everyone else, they've adopted a strategy of eating mature leaves. So these are the animals that when they go to the grocery store and they see one bag of nasty Brussels sprouts in the back of the shelf, they're like, aha, I shall eat that. And I don't really know, like that doesn't sound that great to me, but this is what they've decided to do. And it turns out if there's no other folivore in their habitat to compete with them, they can eat the nicer stuff. They can eat the young leaves as well. But if there's any sense of competition from other lemurs, they'll fall back on these nasty mature leaves and they can survive on it. And the fact that they can survive on these old nasty leaves is kind of a feat of nature. And then the bamboo lemurs, true to their name, eat bamboo. So we're good at naming things for what they do. And so bamboo lemurs naturally eat bamboo, but there's a lot of variation in what they eat, even just within bamboo. So the greater bamboo lemur tends to eat the giant bamboo species that grows in Madagascar, and the lesser bamboo lemurs tend to eat some of the smaller species of bamboo. And they also vary in what parts of the bamboo plant they eat. So lesser bamboo lemurs might eat more of the shoots and the leaves, whereas the greater bamboo lemur might eat more of the pith and the culm. And so you can see that there's all these different dietary strategies in these 50 plus species of lemur. So they're really filling every niche that they can in Madagascar to avoid eating the same things. And it's just this real amazing richness of diversity just within this group of folivorous lemurs. Which sort of brings us to the question of like, why are there so many species of folivore? Why is Madagascar hosting this ridiculous diversity of leaf-eating lemurs? And this also harkens back to the first talk in the series on sort of the unique features of Madagascar, which is that Madagascar has a ton of different habitats. We got rainforest, we got dry forest, we got spiny forest, we got every type of habitat. And different habitats are going to support different species of animal and different nutritional requirements, even within leaf eaters. And of course, a lot of these habitats are forests, and forests have a lot of leaves. So leaves are pretty ubiquitous in the environments of these animals. And so it might seem like a good idea to eat what's around and what's plentiful. And I'll come back to that because it's going to turn out it's not that easy to eat leaves. But if you're not going to eat leaves, you need to eat something else instead. And so for a lot of primates, what they'll choose to eat is fruit. And of course, there are fruits in Malagasy forests as well, but fruit can be particularly unreliable in Madagascar for a couple of reasons. If you also remember back from our first talk, we talked about how Madagascar is routinely hit by these enormous weather systems that are random, that are stochastic, but you know they're coming. And so you get these big cyclones, you get droughts, you get floods, and all of these conditions can make fruit very unreliable. And some years there just might not be enough fruit to really support healthy populations. And so it might not be a great idea to eat something that's not going to be around consistently in your environment. And the other thing it turns out is that fruit is really weird in Madagascar. So there was this cool article that came out where the sort of summary headline was "Lemurs are weird because Madagascar's fruit is weird." And it turns out one of the things about fruit in Madagascar is that it's really low in nitrogen. And nitrogen is a really important element for mammals to survive. It's one of the critical components of things like amino acids and protein. And one of the places where we can get nitrogen usually is from fruit. But the fruit in Madagascar has very, very low nitrogen. And so it's possible that the lemurs are turning to eating leaves as a source of nitrogen if they can't get it from fruit. Of course, leaves are full of nitrogen, but we're going to find out in a little bit that it's not that easy to get at that nitrogen. And so it seems like there's a really good number of reasons for why these lemurs should be eating leaves. Leaves are ubiquitous in the forest. Fruit might be kind of unreliable. But it turns out, like I've been saying, that it's really, really hard to make a living on leaves. And so let's run down some of the challenges that come with folivory. And I've got a video here of Gertrude eating leaves just to keep your attention. So, and I'll point out, this is Gertrude here eating a blackberry bush. So this thing has a bunch of thorns on it and she doesn't care. She's just taking those thorns and she's chomping on it. So in general, leaves are nasty, right? They're bitter in taste. I have tried most of the leaves that our lemurs eat here at the Duke Lemur Center, with the exception of poison ivy and poison oak, and they taste pretty gross, I have to say, but these guys don't seem to mind it at all. So we'll talk about how it is that they overcome the bitter taste. Leaves are also generally low in sugar, so there's not a whole lot of available energy in these leaves for these animals to get. There's not a lot of quick energy that you might get from eating, say, a piece of fruit. And leaves are also chock-a-block full of fiber, which can be a good thing in many ways. Fiber is really healthy for us, but if there's so much that you need to figure out how to metabolize it, that's going to become a challenge as well. And they're also chock-a-block full of something called tannins that can be a problem, and we're going to get to those too. So let's start with fiber. So some fiber is really, really hard to digest. And I'm going to use cellulose as an example. Cellulose is possibly the most ubiquitous plant fiber in nature. Every plant has it. And cellulose is the fiber that forms part of the structure of plant walls. So it's part of the reason why plants have their rigid shape and they can stand up, is this fiber called cellulose. Now, the problem is that mammals don't have the enzymes to break it down. We have no way to get rid of this fiber. We have no way to metabolize it and turn it into energy. We're really, really terrible at this. We don't have the genes in our genome to do it, and we don't have the enzymes to do it. And so, like I said, it's really, really hard to turn this plant matter, this fiber, into energy because we don't have a way to get rid of it. And then tannins also present a problem. And so tannins are one group of what we call the plant defensive compounds. And so if you think about from the plant's perspective, the plant doesn't want to be eaten, right? The plant put all this energy into making these leaves, and the plant doesn't want those leaves to get eaten. And so plants produce what are called these plant defensive compounds to deter herbivory. And there are thousands of different types of these compounds, and tannins are one such group of those. And these are what are responsible for the bitter taste in these leaves, because the plants are saying to the leaf eater, don't eat me, I taste nasty. And so that's on purpose. The plants are purposefully sending this signal. But they also can be a problem nutritionally, in that some of these compounds can actually get into the bloodstream and they can get into your cells and they can cause damage directly. And some of them can be anti-nutritional, and that they tend to be bound to proteins. So within the leaf structure, a lot of times what you'll have is your protein being bound up by these tannins or these plant secondary compounds. And that means that you can't get the protein. So you're eating this protein, but you can't digest it until you can get rid of those tannins. And of course, mammals lack the enzymes to get rid of a lot of these tannins. We can't do it. We can't cleave those tannins off of the protein. And so without outside help, that protein is no longer available to us. And the whole reason for eating leaves was to get at this nitrogen, and now we can't get at it. So that doesn't make sense at all. And so what's happened in Madagascar and in other places on Earth as well is that leaf eaters have had to come up with a lot of strategies for how to make folivory work. And these strategies are comprehensive across the entire body of these animals. Pretty much everything that they do is to make sure that they can make leaf eating work and to make sure that they can get energy from these sort of like ridiculously nasty old resources that nobody else wants. And so I thought I'd walk through a couple of my favorite adaptations today. And this is not a comprehensive list at all, but we're going to end up with the gut microbiome, which is where the heart of my research is. But starting way up the pipeline, we got to start with the animal's teeth. And so here what I'm showing you are the molars, so the chomping, grinding teeth of 3 lemurs. So this is a frugivore, a fruit eater, like this dwarf lemur here named Auklet. And we've also got the tooth of a mouse lemur, an omnivore, like this lemur named Ariadne here is a mouse lemur. And then we've got a folivore, like this woolly lemur, who doesn't have a name because this guy's from Madagascar. And I should say that this is work that was done by Dr. Doug Boyer, who's faculty here at Duke University, and his colleagues. So if you're interested in tooth morphology, you can check out some of his work as well. But if you look at these molars, one of the things I hope you can see is that the height of the molar is increasing as we go from fruit eater to leaf eater. And specifically, the cusps of the molar are getting really, really tall. And so this is really important for shearing leaves. And so the teeth of these guys are actually evolved to shear leaves and to grind them down so they can be really efficient at eating as many leaves as possible. So if you ever watch these guys out in the forest, just the sheer volume of leaves that they can stuff in their face and swallow is like rapid. It's so impressive how fast it is that they can make this happen. And I spend way more time chewing my salad than these guys ever would. So it all starts actually in the mouth in terms of how these guys are getting it. Also in the mouth, there's a lot of variation in the receptors. And so this is getting into that idea of how these animals are withstanding these bitter tastes. And so on all of our tongues, we have all of these taste receptors, and there's many, many different types of receptors. Some receptors are sensitive to sweet, some to salt, some to sour, and some to bitter. And even within the bitter taste receptors, there are many, many, many different types, and each type picks up different types of compounds. So some of us are more sensitive to certain types of bitter taste versus other types of bitter taste. And like, yeah, right, I was saying these are sensitive to different types of compounds. And so it could be that these lemurs have some changes in which bitter taste receptors they have, or maybe they have fewer, or they have some kind of changes to them so that they don't work as well. But somehow that enables them to withstand this bitter taste and not be put off by it. And I'll point out that this is a project I've actually got ongoing right now that's spearheaded by my friend and colleague, Dr. Elaine Guevara here at Duke. And so we're actually looking at the genes that are involved in these taste receptors. And maybe this is part of the puzzle as to why these lemurs are willing to eat stuff that like really tastes nasty. And as we move down the tract, we've done the teeth, we've done the tongue, and we move into the gastrointestinal system. These guys have major changes to their gastrointestinal system. So here I'm showing you the gut tract of a fruit-eating rough lemur, an omnivorous or generalist ring-tailed lemur, and of course our favorite cockerel shafak. And I'll point out that these were drawings that were done by Dr. Jenny Campbell, who's faculty over at NC State, who does a lot of work with nutrition and physiology. And so what you can see is as we move from fruit eater to leaf eater, we have pretty extreme changes in the gastrointestinal morphology of these animals. And a couple of features I want to point out are this structure that looks kind of like the tail end of a rattlesnake, and it's called a cecum. And so if our appendix was essentially elongated and like a balloon with some weird saculations in it, it would be a cecum. And so that's what these guys have, is this extremely blown out cecum. And so unlike most of Earth's herbivores, like your cows, your rhinoceros, your hippo, those guys tend to do their digestion in the forestomach, in the front of their gut, right? We learned this in school that they have multi-chambered stomachs and they're doing all this ruminant digestion. These guys don't do this. All of their digestion of the leaf matter happens in the hind gut. And so they've had to figure out strategies to make leaf digestion possible in this type of system. And so the cecum becomes really, really important. And so the cecum is the powerhouse site of microbial fermentation. And so bookmark the word microbe there because we're going to come back to the bacteria. But basically the leaves get shunted into the cecum, and they're attacked by microbes to go about doing the hard work of digestion for the animals. And so they have this enormous fermentative chamber there. That these other species don't necessarily have as big of because they don't need it. And then the other feature is that these guys have incredibly long intestines. And actually the intestines of the shafak are about 9 times its body length. And that cecum is another 1 times its body length. And so this is just a very, very long gut system. So this ruffed lemur at the fruit eater all the way on the left might pass their food in 1 to 3 hours. So it takes them about 1 to 3 hours to turn food to poop. In these leaf-eating lemurs, that's about 1 to 3 days. So they really have this elongated gastrointestinal system that provides the space and time for leaf digestion to occur because it's quite a slow process. And with that said, there's this enormous variation across these animals with different feeding strategies, but there's also variation even within the folivores. So if we come back to our original casted characters and the leaf eaters, and we have our shafak now as our reference point, you can actually see that as we move from an animal that's quite frugofolivorous, that eats quite a lot of fruit, to an animal that's really an extreme leaf eater, we see correlational changes in the gastrointestinal system and further elongation and increasing the volume capacity of that cecum. And so in the shafak, where the cecum might be 1 times body length, in the indri, that cecum can be 3 times the body length of the animal. So these are just enormous structures that are really there to provide that space and time for microbes to do the dirty work. And so the indrids, this group of first lemurs, have really gone down this route of elongating their gastrointestinal system. But true to its nature about being weird, the sportive lemur has done something completely different. So if you remember, this is the guy that's eating those mature, nasty leaves. And so you might think he needs the biggest like gastrointestinal system of all because he's eating the diet that has the most fiber in it. And it turns out they've gone down a different idea. They had a different solution to this problem. And that sportive lemurs actually have the shortest small intestine of any primate that's ever been measured, but they have this enormous balloon-like cecum. And so what we think they do is they eat this mature leaf matter that gets shunted directly into the cecum where microbes attack it and turn it into nutrients. And then what they do is they actually poop out the content of their cecum. So they excrete cecal digestive, which is full of these nutrients, and then they eat it again. So they re-ingest cecal content. And this is something that also animals like rabbits do, and it's called cecotrophy. And so the idea is that by eating it again, they're giving their gastrointestinal system a second chance to get at all of those nutrients. So whereas the first species decided to elongate their physical gastrointestinal system, and that's how they're going to increase the time that the food spends in their bellies, the sportive lemur is doing this using behavioral tactics. It's basically just giving the food a second time through by eating it again. So it's a completely different way to achieve the same goal, and showing that different lemurs who end up in the same strategy can use very, very different solutions to make that strategy work for them. And then I'll say with the bamboo lemurs, we don't know nearly as much about their gastrointestinal morphology as we do some of these other species. And I'll point out that this diagram that we do have of the lesser bamboo lemur is also from Dr. Jenny Campbell's work. And so I would sort of assume that the greater bamboo lemur has a similar gut tract to the lesser bamboo lemur, but you can see these guys have also gone down a different strategy where they're really placing a lot of effort in their large intestine and changing the structure of that large intestine. So despite having a relatively short gut tract, these guys also have a really, really long time that the food spends in their systems. They have a long retention time, and that's been in part because of these changes to their large intestine. All right, so we have all this variation in these different species, in what family they're coming from, in where they're living in Madagascar, in the food that they're eating, in the structure of their gut, in their teeth, in their bitter taste receptors. There's this whole toolkit to make these different folivorous strategies work. And the big one that we haven't talked about yet, which is my favorite because we're saving the best for last, is the gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome is the complex community of trillions of microbes that inhabit animal gastrointestinal tracts. Literally every part of those gut diagrams I just showed is covered in bacteria and in microscopic organisms like archaea and also some fungi. There's lots of things that live there, bacteria being one of the most critically important ones. And that may sound terrifying, right? Bacteria bad, they cause illness, they make us sick. But it turns out that a lot of the bacteria that live in the gut microbiome and in our gastrointestinal systems are really important for keeping us healthy. And they perform critical things for us that we can't do on our own. And they're part of what makes us us. And there's a couple of points to know about the microbiome before we dive into the lemur microbiome, which is that different microbes do different things. So not every microbe does the same thing. In the same way that not every big animal on Earth does the same thing. A giraffe and a fish do very different things on Earth. The next thing is that microbes do different things under different conditions. And that's also the same as macroorganisms. So when I'm cold, I shiver, but when I'm hot, I sweat. And so different microbes will do different things if the conditions are, say, if there's more oxygen or less oxygen, if things are hotter or colder, microbes will do different things. And the big kicker is that these microbes are going to be really, really important for digestion. They're important for our digestion as humans, but they're also going to be key for the digestion for these leaf eaters. And microbes do a number of functions for these leaf eaters that really enable folivory as a feeding strategy. And so the first is that they are chiefly responsible for converting that fiber into energy. Because remember, we talked about how we mammals don't have the enzymes to break down the fiber, but bacteria do. And so what happens is we eat all this fiber, it gets into our digestive system, maybe in the cecum, maybe in the colon, and there the bacteria are like, aha, my time has come, I shall eat this fiber. And bacteria go about digesting all of this fiber, and they convert it into something called short chain fatty acids. And these compounds are basically poop for the bacteria, but they're energy for us. And so we pick them up in our colon, and they get into our bloodstream, and they travel all around our body. And these short chain fatty acids are really important energy. And so in a human, the estimates are that these short chain fatty acids might account for like 6 to 10% of our daily energy demands. And so up to 10% of our energy is being supplied by these bacteria. But in a leaf eater, it could be up to like 60% of the daily energy demands are coming from these bacteria. So this becomes really important for how leaf eaters get energy from leaves. The second thing that these bacteria can do is solve the tannin problem for us. So remember we talked about how these tannins are bound to proteins in leaves and make it really hard for us to get at those proteins and that nitrogen. And so here what I'm showing you is that problem. And so we've got in green is the actual protein that we want, and all of the little other compounds that are stuck to it, all 5 of those sort of brownish, reddish, blackish compounds, those are the tannins. And you can see this protein is just surrounded by these tannins. It's really, really challenging to get at. And again, we don't have the enzymes necessarily to get rid of them, but bacteria do. Bacteria are excellent at getting rid of these tannins and making that protein bioavailable, both to the microbe, but also to us, the host. And then lastly, these bacteria can synthesize vitamins for us. So microbes actually produce things like vitamin K and the entire vitamin B series. And this vitamin B series is really important for leaf eaters because we tend to get a lot of our vitamin B from things like dairy and meat, but obviously sifakas are not going to the steak shop, they're eating leaves. And so these B vitamins aren't that prevalent necessarily in leaves. And so if microbes can supply those for you, that can help you survive on a diet that doesn't fulfill all of your vitamin requirements. And so learning about all these things that microbes do and why they might be important for folivores is what brought me to sort of ask the question of like, is the gut microbiome the key to leaf eating in lemurs? Is this what unlocks leaf eating as a strategy? And so this is a lot of what I spend my time studying as a research scientist. And the way I do it is by using genetics. And so this is how most of us study the gut microbiome right now in science. And in particular, we're studying this gene, or rather this protein stemming from this gene. And it looks kind of fancy and there's different colors and it's kind of cool. And it has a really complicated name, which it's called the 16S rRNA gene, which doesn't matter at all. But what's important about this gene is that all bacteria have it. This is a gene that's present in every bacterium we've ever studied on Earth, but different types of bacteria have a different copy of this gene. And so if we can identify which copies exist in a sample, we can figure out which bacteria exist in that sample. And so we can use just this one gene to figure out which microbes live in a community. And it turns out that we're also getting really good at finding this gene. We can find it in every type of sample we've ever explored now. We can find it on deep sea vents. We can find it in soil. We can find it in lemur guts. We can find it in human guts. There's even people studying it in outer space. So we are getting excellent at finding this particular gene. And so when we do this type of sequencing analysis, what we get back looks something like this. And so here, for example, would be the pie chart that represents an entire microbiome. And you can see different microbes live in this particular sample. There's all these different colors which represent different microbes. And the slice of the pie tells you how much of that microbe lives in that sample. So in this mock community, we can see that this light blue microbe, microbe 1, is the dominant microbe. And so then we can maybe link what microbe 1 does to something like fiber fermentation or tannin metabolism or something like that. And so this is sort of how we study it. And so applying this to some of our lemurs, this was one of my favorite projects I ever got to do, was we compared the gut microbiome in sifakas, indri, woolly lemurs, and sportive lemurs. So these are lemurs that we remember eat 4 different diets, despite all being folivores. They have 4 different gastrointestinal systems, but these guys all lived in the same forest in Madagascar. So these are 4 folivores living in the same place at the same time, and by and large doing the same thing, which is some form of leaf eating. And it turns out they have completely different microbiomes. So what I hope you can see is, don't get bogged down in the details of all the different colors, but these are 4 leaf-eating lemurs that are living in the same place at the same time, and their microbiomes look completely different. And one of the big patterns I hope you can see is that the farther up the chart we go, the more of these blue microbes we have. And the farther down the chart we go, the more of these green microbes we have. And so there's many different types of blues and there's many different types of greens, but if you sort of squint, you can see we have more blue up top and more green down bottom. Now, it turns out that these blue microbes really like to eat things that are like digestible fiber, specifically the fiber you might be getting from fruit. And these green microbes really like to eat tough, nasty, recalcitrant fibers like cellulose. And so we can see that the different diets of the animals correlate to different microbiome communities. And actually the function of those microbes makes total sense in terms of what the animals are eating. So these sifakas who are eating more fruit have more microbes that like to eat fruit. And these sportive lemurs who are eating more nasty leaves leaves have microbes that really respond to tough, nasty fiber. And we can see similar patterns in many other comparisons. So for example, if we look at a sifaka that lives in the rainforest versus a sifaka that lives in the dry forest, we're going to see more of those blue microbes, the digestible ones, upticked in the animals that live in the rainforest where they probably get more fruit. And we're going to see more of those green microbes upticked in the animals that live in the dry forest where they're probably eating more leaves. If we look within the same species, our favorite cockerel sifaka, and we look at two different populations, say that live in the Anjajavi forest and the Ankara fonseca forest that are separated by this big river system, we can actually see that the microbiomes look pretty similar in terms of these different populations of the same species, but the major differences, once again, are in these blue microbes, and that one population has more of these dark blue microbes, and another population has more of these light blue microbes. And so this might relate to even minor differences in what type of fruit or flowers these animals are eating on different sides of this river system. If we come here to the Duke Lemur Center and look at our lemurs, we can find the same patterns when we let our lemurs free range out in the forest and eat whatever they want. When we let them free range in the forest, they tend to eat quite a lot of fruits and flowers and young leaves. And when they're not free ranging, they don't eat those substrates. And so we can see the same patterns where the blue microbes uptick when the animals are eating more fruits and flowers, more digestible diets, and the green microbes uptick when they're eating those less digestible diets. And so putting this all together, what does any of this mean? It's really, really fun to see these patterns, and lots of pictures of lemurs eating things is always more fun than anything. But what does any of this mean scientifically? And so I think what I'm coming to understand is that the gut microbes of these folivorous lemurs are what enable leaf digestion. They make it possible to survive on leaves. They're part of the picture. They're part of the toolkit for enabling folivory. And there's also a lot of variation, more than we maybe would have expected, depending on the feeding strategy of the animal, what habitat it lives in, and actually what diet it's eating on a day-to-day basis. And even more broadly than this, I would say that the gut microbiomes of folivorous lemurs are necessary for survival. These lemurs would not survive without their microbes the same way that we would not survive without ours. These microbes are highly specialized for each species. They do very, very specific tasks, very specific types of fiber digestion or tannin metabolism, and they're very tuned to their specific host. So the microbiome of a cockerel sifaka looks nothing like the microbiome of a different type of sifaka, looks nothing like the microbiome of an indri. They're very specialized to the lemur that harbors them. These communities are flexible, but only to a point. And so they can adapt to dietary change, but not that much. And so if we were to go on and feed these animals like a steak, their microbes probably couldn't handle that. And that's probably why these animals couldn't adapt to big different diets, to big changes in diet. And so I think these microbes are probably really important to consider as part of the package when we're designing things like husbandry strategies for lemurs under human care, and also for conservation in Madagascar, because they can help explain how these animals eat specific diets and how they're going to adapt to changing environments or not. And so putting this all together then, leaf eating in lemurs, which you might think makes a lot of sense because leaves are ubiquitous in nature, everybody does it, there's a ton of salad, why not? Fruit is weird. But it turns out that leaf eating in lemurs is costly, and it requires a lot of specialized adaptations to make it work. Those adaptations can start as high up as the teeth and go all the way down to the gut microbiome with everything in between. And there's a lot of adaptations I didn't even have time to get into today. But there's a lot of meat to get into in this question of folivory and how animals are surviving on these sort of weird diets in nature, and how Madagascar in particular, and why Madagascar hosts this diversity of folivorous species that we don't see anywhere else. So this has been the research focus that I have found fascinating through my career. I hope it sparked some interest in everybody today, and if nothing else, you're going to have salad for lunch or for dinner. But if this wasn't your cup of tea, or you want to hear more, I also invite you to join us next week when Marine is going to talk about hibernation, if you're interested in different metabolic strategies in these guys, the dwarf lemurs of Madagascar. And with that, I'm happy to take any and all questions about leaf eating, and I will shunt all questions on hibernation to next week.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Lydia. Not only was it a great presentation, but I love this slide before you take it off the screen. I like picturing it as if the lemur were actually that size compared to the forest, and how terrifying that would be if you were just along the riverbank. So thank you for that. But yeah, if you want to come out of screen share, we can have a bit of a conversation. We got tons of people joining. Where do we have people from? Michigan, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and more, all on YouTube. So welcome into everyone on YouTube. I'm going to share a YouTube question first, and then I'm going to go to our live groups. We've probably got enough time for 6-7 questions, something like that. So I'm going to start with one that relates to your gut size, and I think this is really interesting, comparing folivory versus frugivory, omnivory. If what's the exact question? Sorry. If you're a folivore, like a lemur, eats something other than a leaf, will it get sick? So if it eats fruit or meat or whatever. What happens?
Excellent question. And it depends on what they're eating, but probably yes. And so, like I said, there's some flexibility in these diets. There's some flexibility in the microbes. Like shafaks are naturally eating some fruit in their diet, whereas some of these other species aren't. But if a shafak were to eat too much fruit, it would absolutely get sick. And we've actually seen this in some of the populations under human care, that, you know, if a shafak might eat too much fruit, that would make it ill as well. And so generally what happens is in these long gastrointestinal system, the fruit might rot before it gets passed because it's digested so quickly, but then it's stuck there for like a day until it can get passed. And so it might turn to ethanol and get fermented really quickly, which you would think might make them like a little tipsy, but in reality probably makes them pretty sick. So these folivores are really specialized on these leaves, and they can't just eat anything. They really have to eat the diet that they've evolved to eat. And I should point out the Lemur Center does an excellent job in making sure that each species gets the diet that's really specific for its diet. And we've done a lot of work to make sure that our shafaks in particular are getting a really well-rounded and balanced diet that's suitable for them. So
Fantastic.
yeah.
Great.
But don't feed lemurs meat.
Don't feed lemurs meat. I love, sorry, just really briefly, you mentioned the Duke Lemur Center again. So this is something we've done a lot of programs with you guys. I encourage everyone who's watching, look up the Duke Lemur Center. A lot of people ask questions about animals in captivity, and I think that when it's done really, really well, it's a remarkable learning and teaching tool to the public, and a remarkable way of learning about animals in a completely different way. So really exciting, and do check that out. All right, we got 2 hands up. I'm going to go to Genevieve and Juliet in Oshawa, our Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants rock stars. So ladies, if you guys have a question for us, just demute your mic. You should be good to go. And yep, go for it.
I'd like to know, can all lemurs get COVID-19? If not, can some of the species get it?
Yeah,
that's a good question, and one we've been hearing a lot. So the question is if lemurs can get COVID-19. And what I'll say is I have not heard of any case yet in which a lemur has been confirmed to have COVID-19, and we haven't seen that in any of our animals here, and I haven't seen anything about anywhere else. But I'll say that COVID-19 has popped up in a lot of different mammals. I've seen cases of it in pigs and pugs and tigers. And so probably most mammals are capable of getting COVID-19, but what would vary is how susceptible or sensitive a species is. And so there's been some nice work coming out looking at like the receptors for COVID-19 and looking at the genes that underlie those receptors, showing that most mammals have the receptors to receive the virus, but whether or not you get sick really depends on how sensitive those receptors would be. And so many primates, like apes or some of the monkeys, would be much more susceptible to the virus than lemurs would be because they're so removed from us. But yeah, it looks like, you know, if a pug can get it, my guess would be most mammals can get it.
Yeah, thanks. Great question, guys. We get this a lot lately with conservation stories, so I'm really happy we got a chance to cover that. All right, we're going to go to Vishakhapatnam in India, all the way in India, to hear a question from Akash. So Akash, if you got a question for us, come on up, man.
Okay, namaste.
Did I pronounce the town right? I hope so.
Yeah. Okay, my question is, do composition and specialization of gut microbiome in lemurs can ever change? Will they change?
So can the gut microbiome of lemurs change? And I would say yes. And it really depends on the species and the strategy, the feeding strategy that the animals have. So we've seen this at the Lemur Center where we see changes in the microbiome with our shafaks who are free ranging out in our woods where they get to live out in the forest here versus our shafaks that are not free ranging. And we can see those changes in the microbiome, and we can track that those changes can occur in as little as 2 days. So you can have really, really fast changes. But what does that change mean? Is it the whole thing changes, or is that one microbe changes? And so the degree of change, the strength of the change can be really variable depending on what the conditions are. So I would say that yes, there is always some flexibility in the microbiome, but if I decided to eat, you know, the diet of a shafak, I would not my microbiome would not turn over to that of a shafak in a couple of days. I'm always still going to look like a human. I'm just going to look like a human who eats more leaves.
We need to get like a highlight reel of all your informal moments in this presentation because it's amazing. Like honestly, we can get like this 2-minute incredible thing. Anyway, thank you for that. Great question, guys. And if you're keen more on microbiome, I'm really happy we got a chance to cover it in detail today. But John Lynch, so he did a scientist who solely studies the microbiome. That's all he does a few months back. So I encourage you to check that out as a follow-up. All right, in our YouTube chat, we got this like big ring-tailed lemur exciting period for a while there. And so one of the questions was, are they not folivores? Like what do ring-tailed lemurs eat? Because people are really keen on ring-tailed lemurs from Madagascar.
Ring-tailed lemurs eat everything. They are like the quintessential generalist of Madagascar. And that's also part of the reason they survive so well under human care. You can see them at almost every accredited zoo and facilities because they really have quite an adaptable feeding strategy. They can eat fruit when it's around, they can eat leaves when they're around, they can eat insects when they're around, they can even eat some small vertebrates like chameleons or things like that when they're around. They eat everything. They're like the kid at the party who just grabs handfuls of every bowl that's out, and that's fine with them. They're completely not specialized, which of course in itself is a type of specialization, right? They're specialized to not be specialized, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, they're really, really hardy and really flexible. And there's some nice work showing their sort of dietary adaptations across seasons and across climate events and things like that. So for those of us who are interested in like specialization, we tend not to focus on the ring-tailed lemur that much because they're so good at doing everything. But yeah, they're an impressive species for that reason alone.
Nice. Thanks so much, Lydia. All right, we're going to go to Lars and Rune in Lancaster, Pennsylvania with their stuffed sifaka. It's so exciting. Hi, guys. If you guys have a question for us, or if your mom does, you ask away. Don't be shy. All good.
They adopted Didius and Terrence at the Duke Lemur Center, and they were curious about how they're doing and what they like to eat as baby lemurs.
Nice.
So they're both doing great, and unfortunately they're not babies anymore, so they're now eating a full-blown normal adult diet. So it's crazy to think how fast they can grow, but they're now eating the same things as mom and dad and their older siblings. But of course, as young infants, all lemurs eat milk the same way that we do, that they get from mom. And then different species will be weaned off of mom's milk and start eating adult diets at different times. So dwarf lemurs that Marina will talk about tend to stop drinking milk really, really fast, and they tend to start eating their adult diet really quickly. Sifakas are a bit slower, so they might start trying some of mom's leaves at a couple of months of age, but they won't be fully eating that adult diet till they're a little bit older. But yeah, Terrence and Didius are strong and healthy and doing great.
Fantastic. Great question, boys. All right. I love this question from Kit, who's 3 years old, and they want to know how long lemurs' tails are.
Wow, so I love these questions, but they're so hard to answer because it really depends on the species. So you can have a mouse lemur that's this big with, a tail that's 15, 17 centimeters. And you can also have a sifak who's got, it's a couple of feet long. Their tails are really impressive. So it really depends on the species. But my favorite is probably the indri, who's the biggest living lemur in Madagascar, who's got probably the shortest tail of all. Little stubby, stumpy, no tail there. So it really depends on the species, but you could totally spend the day looking up online tail lengths for all the different lemur species. There's 107 species because a lot of that information is available.
Nice. Fantastic. Speaking of indri, you've mentioned it a few times. Everyone, when they finish this broadcast, should just go straight to YouTube and listen to an indri's call. It's one of the coolest things in all of nature. It'll blow your mind.
Yes.
So we're going to take one more question from a live group. I know some of our other people have some more, but we're nearing the end of the broadcast. So what I'd love you guys to do, if you have more questions, send them to me. I'll pass them along to Dr. Greene and we can answer them that way too. But I will go to Miss Meraki's group in Thunder Bay, Ontario, if you want to wrap us up with one really cool question. Right? Good to go.
So out of the adaptations, there's all these species of lemurs, and the one species is doing really well. Is there one species that, because of their attempts at their different microbes and their digestive tract, is there one species that's really not thriving due to environmental changes, or just that adaptation isn't really working for them as well? One that's more at risk?
You've hit on one of my favorite topics, which isn't how endangered lemurs are, but getting into ecological specialization, because we do see this big pattern where species that tend to be more specialized on the whole tend to be more at risk of extinction. And so this happens for many different reasons. You can be specialized due to your diets or due to your habitat. And so what we see is that the animals that are the most specialized in any direction tend to be most at risk. So this explains why the ruffed lemurs, who are extreme fruit specialists, are really critically endangered, because that's pretty much what they eat. And also all the other end of the spectrum, why the really, really like strict folivorous species tend to be the most at risk on that side, because if the leaves aren't there, or if there are specific leaves aren't there, they're not going to do well. And what we see is that the species in the middle, who are more flexible and can sort of fall back on different things, tend to be doing better. And then you also get animals who are extremely endangered, not because of their dietary specialization, but because of other types of specialization. And the best example of that is Seabreeze dwarf lemur, who is a high altitude specialist. They only live in forests above 1,500 meters, and there aren't that many of those, and they're being lost the same way that all forests are in Madagascar. And so they're restricted to a very small area to begin with, which is also shrinking. And so they're actually the most critically endangered of all the dwarf lemurs for that specific reason. And so what you tend to see is this pattern where generalists do better because they're more flexible, they can live in different areas, they can eat lots of things. But animals who are really specialized, who have gone down one strategy, tend not to do that well. That was a very long-winded answer, sorry.
No, that's a great answer. It's something that I don't know we've ever covered in one of these broadcasts. It's sort of how like things can evolve themselves into like a trap, basically,
yes.
where they, have a difficulty surviving if anything happens to the, unique specialization that they've come to. Pandas are a good example of that. I mean, that's why there's so much conservation work being done on them, because if you eat one thing in one kind of forest, it can be tricky for you if there's any threat to that. So really cool question, really cool answer. Before we wrap up too, I want to note someone played the indri call at home and scared their cat and dog, which is amazing. So thank you for that. Thanks, Carolyn. I want to wrap up, Lydia, with just one more question. That is, so people have learned so much about lemurs, the first two broadcasts today, and they're keen to find out more. They're keen to help conserve lemurs. Where can we send them to keep learning going?
So I think the internet is a great tool if you have access to the internet. I mean, just plug in your favorite species. You're going to find hundreds of websites that have great information. The Lemur Center's website, lemur.duke.edu, is a great place to start. We do have a lot of information on the species that we maintain. Wikipedia also has a lot of information. And like I said, the IUCN, International Union for Conservation, just dropped the new assessments for all 107 lemur species. So if you go to the IUCN Red List and again, plug in your favorite species, there's a ton of new information there about how those species are doing, what threats they're facing, where they live. And you can also find a lot of resources through the IUCN's website, like papers you can read, links you can follow up on, scientists you could search. So yeah, I would spend some time Googling if you're able. And then if you have really specific questions, definitely find the scientist or the conservationist that studies that and reach out and see if they can answer them, because they probably will.
Scientists love to share knowledge with the public. So if you find scientists online, a lot of scientists, their emails are accessible on university websites. Send them an email. They don't usually bite. And certainly through this platform too, you can send me questions. We'll pass them along to Dr. Greene. Check out our Duke Lemur Center presentations, Planet Madagascar. We've done a bunch of presentations to this. So some really great opportunities if you're keen to keep learning. Lydia, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us once again. And as you know from your other broadcasts, what I'm going to do now is demute everyone's microphones. And so boys and girls, all our families at home, if you guys could join me in saying a huge thank you to Lydia for joining us today. You are all good to go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Awesome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining in. And we're so looking forward to next week. So next week, Lydia, if you want to announce that again, we've got a follow-up presentation of this. We'll wrap up with that.
Yeah, so the fourth part of our 4-part series is going to happen next week, same time, same place, my living room. But instead, you're going to hear from Dr. Marina Blanco, who's another research scientist at the Duke Lemur Center. And while I study the giant diurnal lemurs of Madagascar, she studies the tiny nocturnal ones. And specifically, she studies hibernation and how these guys use an extreme strategy to cope with fluctuating resources in Madagascar. And they are incredibly cute. And I'm sure her presentation is going to be full of pictures. So stay tuned for that.
Super cool. Can't wait. Looking forward to hosting. For everyone else, have a wonderful rest of your day. We look forward to having you guys back soon, and see you soon.